Hello, my name is Jeffrey Booth, as you probably already know, and welcome to Stories for My Lights, a channel where I create improvised stories based on random words and concepts for my son, Alden. Now, if you should happen to arrive to this channel, welcome. Again, I don't know how you got here, but it is great for you to get a view into the insanity of how my mind works, so that you may be able to better avoid suffering from insanity yourself. Now, tonight's story, I'm going to pull some words from the magical book of words and phrases. And this is a book that while I'm sleeping, words magically appear here, and I never know what they're gonna be. Today's story is going to feature a rock that will answer any question you ask with the truth. Now, it might not be a truth that you like, but it will be the truth. The second thing that is going to be part of our story is a Chinese star that explodes upon impact. See how I just exploded vocally? That is how the Chinese star will operate. And this one, I'm not sure how this came to be in my magical book of words, but it's a mask that grows grasshoppers. What? Like a Halloween mask. All right, now, forgive me for rubbing my eyes. I ate a banana just before this video and I'm all hopped up on energy and it's making my eyes itch. All right, now this story begins with a man named Oslo. And you see, Oslo was a grown-up like me, although much smarter and more successful, who had the life that he had always wanted. He had a gigantic house with a swimming pool and a hot tub. He had a job that was prestigious. He was an executive at a big company and he made lots of money. He had a dog. He had what he would consider friends, although at the time he didn't know that they weren't really his friends. He had a fancy car. He had nice clothes, unlike me, who wears shirts that are 12 years old. He had houses filled with all the artwork you could want. He had a motorcycle. He went on the fanciest vacations to the most luxurious tropical islands. His life was what most people would consider amazing. He considered it amazing. He always had a little feeling that something was wrong. But he tried to squash that little voice inside of him because he had so much to be grateful for. Well, one day Oslo and one of his friends from work decided to go to a flea market. And for those of you who have yet to experience the grandeur and glory of a flea market, it's merely a series of stands where people basically sell all the old things they don't want. Usually it's junk, but sometimes you get amazing artwork or antiques or things that you can't find anywhere else, especially at stores like Walmart. He was walking around the store with his friend, and his friend was just pointing at all the shops and saying, "Look at this stupid junk. Who would ever have this in their house? Oh, look at that lady's clothes. They're so plebeian. Ugh." And Oslo was getting a little annoyed at his friend, and his friends and the people he worked with always did this. They would find ways to put others down, and he didn't love it, but he just nodded his head and went along. And they finally came to a stall which had before it, on a table, a series of stones. There were gems of blue and green and white, rubies and amethyst and cubic zirconia and diamonds, chunks of what looked to be gold, arrayed in a giant circle. And in the middle of the circle was what looked to be a rather bland stone. It was brown. It didn't have any mica or anything particularly shiny in it. But for some reason, the contrast between the fancy, beautiful jewels and the regular brown stone somehow tickled Oslo's fancy. And so he asked the woman who was at the stand how much the middle rock cost. And she said, "Oh, this rock is not for sale. It is my precious." And he said, "No, really, something about that rock is just calling to me." And she looked at him deep in the eyes like this. And she did not break eye contact. In fact, he got to the point he was getting very uncomfortable. And finally, after a moment, she snapped her fingers and said, you can have it. But all you have to do is give me a promise. And he said, what promise? What kind of promise? And she said, promise me that whatever the stone tells you to do, you will listen. Because for the truth, it always speaks. It speaks the truth of your heart, the truth of your soul, and the truth of the universe. Its truths can be hard, but you must follow them. Oslo was starting to get a little creeped out because usually this is a good general rule for life. When somebody starts talking to you about rocks that are going to tell you what to do, they might be a little bit kooky. However, he really loved that stone, and something about the lady seemed like she was an old soul. She was wise. And so he took the stone and he gave her his word that whatever the stone did, or whatever the stone asked of him, he would do. And his friend was just over there looking at him like, ugh. And his friend went, oh, that lady was so ugly and she is so crazy. And Oslo said, I've had enough. I'm going home. Good night. He couldn't handle any more of his friend's negativity, so he skedaddled to his car and drove home. On the way home, he started thinking, what on earth had he gotten himself into? He had promised, and he did like to keep his promises, that he would listen to whatever a rock told him to do. And she had said it would answer any question or always tell him the truth. Well, he was going through his mind the whole way home, thinking, well, let's pretend I'm in a fantasy world. If I had the ability to ask a rock a question, any question, and it would tell me the truth, what would I ask it? And for some reason, he didn't even know why, the question, am I happy, kept bubbling up into his psyche, into his consciousness. Am I happy? And so he resolved when he got home, he was going to ask it a question. So he kind of procrastinated. He went home and he made some French bread pizzas. They were delicious, but he did burn the top of his mouth. And then he had some ice cream and he distracted himself on his phone. But then he finally said, let's do this. For some reason, again, he didn't know why. He hadn't lit candles in years. He lit a series of candles and surrounded the rock and then got down on his knees and, kind of knelt before the rock. And he said, oh, magic rock, am I happy? And he thought perhaps he had insulted the stone by sarcastically calling it magic rock. And he thought nothing was going to happen. And just as he was about to rise, he saw a beautiful purple halo form from the rock and then slowly spread out into the room until before him was standing the ghostly image of a beautiful woman with long flowing hair, wearing a dress that looked like something you would see from an old movie about, the medieval times in England. And the ghost looked at him with haunting eyes. And she said, in a voice that was not human, yet somehow recognizable, oh, happy you are not. You've seeked the wrong things for your entire life. You seek the ephemeral, the material, when what you want is inside your heart. You must follow your heart. And Oslo just thought to himself for a moment, what is in my heart? And she told him, you have always wanted to travel the world, to give it all away, to see what adventure finds you. This is what is in your heart and how you will find what to do next. And then the purple went right back into the stone. And Oslo just sat there for a moment, thinking, wondering to himself what had just happened. Was he hallucinating? Did he have a really high fever that was making his brain short circuit? Or perhaps had he accidentally eaten a moldy sausage covered in moss? He didn't believe any of those things were true. And he went to bed. And that night, as he lay down, falling asleep, he knew what he had to do. And his dreams that night were about adventure. Not the kind of adventure that you or I would have, but a pirate sailing on the high seas, a knight charging into battle, an explorer going to the deepest, darkest caves. And when he woke up, he put his suit on, for he had to wear a suit and a tie and put gel in his hair. He walked into work and walked into his boss's office, and he immediately said, "I quit." And his boss said, "You can't quit. We've got a big project with Sambalos Corporation coming up." But Oslo said, "I'm done." And he left. He had never felt so good. It was like he had been wearing a jacket made of stone, and somebody had smashed it, obliterated all the chunks, and thrown them into a faraway sewer. And so he went home. And he spent the next months slowly selling all of his things, cleaning his house up, packing one bag that would be his bag for his adventure. And finally, the day came where he sold his house, and he went and he stayed in a hotel room and decided where he was going to go. Well, he reasoned that he had always wanted to go to Europe, and particularly the country he called France, or as I like to call it, Francie, as you might remember from a different video. Don't bother yourself with why I pronounce it that way. Perhaps that is a tale for another time. However, he hated flying, but he reasoned that the stone would tell him the truth. So he asked the stone, "Stone, will I crash on the flight?" And this time the purple halo didn't appear. It just simply said in a frustrated voice, "No, don't be afraid." And so he got on the plane. It was amazing. He got off at a train station in Paris, which I like to call it because I'm obviously in love with Francie. And surprisingly enough, when he got off the train station had all these stalls in it selling weird things. And he had always, since he was a kid, wanted a Chinese star. And for those of you who don't know what a Chinese star, you can either Google it or just imagine in your head a metal object with 4 or 5 points that you can throw it and it would stick in something like a tree or a wall, or in the ancient times, in a samurai or somebody who might be trying to do battle upon you. And he saw a stand that had a Chinese star, and so he bought it. And the man behind the Chinese star had wispy white hair, and he was missing one eye and had an eye patch on it. And for some reason on his eye patch, he had a picture of an avocado. He didn't understand that. But the man said, "Oh, I'll sell you that all right, but beware, it can be explosive." And Oslo just went, "What have I done? Oh, everyone is crazy." And so he bought the Chinese star, put it in his pack, and then he went on. And he saw another stand that had all sorts of masks. And it looked like the masks that you might expect someone in an ancient Polynesian culture to wear. It was made of wood, and it had kind of a friendly face, but it still had a look of mischief on it. And for some reason, he felt drawn to buy that too. He had no idea why, but he had resolved that since the stone had told him he didn't follow his heart, he was going to follow his heart. And so he bought the mask, and he got going. And what he did was so strange for him. He went around Paris, saw the sights, he went to the top of the Eiffel Tower, as high as you can go, and all the things. But that wasn't fulfilling him. He said, "This is just the same world that I was a part of. I mean, it's just cities and shops and people going about their jobs. That is not what I want." So he resolved to find something cool. And he got out his phone, and his phone was the Plantibo X1 Part 4 that had a very big screen. And he looked up abandoned castles, because again, he didn't want to see a tourist castle. I got like a twitch in my eye. Don't let it bother you. And he found a castle called the Summation Castle. And he thought, that's a weird name for a castle, Summation Castle. But he found out that the only way to get to it was to ride the train to an ancient village called Montebello, a very small village with only 500 people in the middle of the woods, and then to ride a bike or hike, a mountain bike or to hike. And so he said, "Okay, fine, I'm gonna do that." And so he got on the train, and he discovered it was a 17-hour ride. And so during the ride, he fell asleep, and he just kept having the strangest dreams. He kept dreaming of him wearing his mask, but these giant, ferocious-looking, almost, grasshoppers jumping off of his face into fires and onto walls and into the mouth of this strange man with a really long beard that went down to his waist. He had dreams of exploding Chinese stars. That one made sense to him. He had dreams of a castle, but this wasn't, it was like a castle in his dream. The walls were almost made of shadow, and creatures were jumping out at him. He was scared. He was freaked out. He even woke himself up by gasping in fear once. And the person next to him on the train went like, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Yes, I'm okay." And the person said, "Okay, but if you gasp again, I'm going to dump water into your ear canals." And Oslo went, "Ugh, what, is everyone I see in Europe crazy?" Obviously they weren't, but he had a knack for attracting strange people. Anyway, at the end of his train ride, he got out and he found the only inn in town, which is called the Crooked Elbow. And he got a room there, and it felt like he was staying in the medieval times once again. His mattress was actually filled with hay, and he had a pillow that was filled with sheep's wool, and it was very comfortable, but it did set off his allergies, and he spent most of the night sneezing, and he even sneezed so hard once that he tooted quite embarrassingly the next morning. Well, after he ate breakfast, because this hotel was kind of like an inn and a tavern combined, he had eggs. They were a little old and kind of gross, but his stomach only gurgled for a while. He got on his mountain bike, which he had rented. It was not a great mountain bike, but it did have knobby tires with lots of tread. And he followed the dirt path that led to the castle. When he came around the bend and he saw the castle become unobscured from the trees that lined the road, his heart jumped. It was beautiful. It was made of stone. It looked like something out of a movie, like something King Arthur or other great kings of the old days might have lived in. But it was not in the greatest shape. There were stones falling off the wall. You could see spider webs in the windows from the towers. Some of the parapet stones were crenellated. Stones were falling down. But the weird thing was there was nobody there. And he thought to himself, I don't even know how. I don't hear anybody. I don't understand. This is the coolest thing he'd ever seen. So he went in, and it was amazing. He was exploring around. He saw rats running about, spiders, but he could also see dilapidated old beds, the kind with 4 posts that it looked like a princess would hang curtains from. He saw old, rusted suits of armor and many other interesting things. And he actually spent the whole day there. He didn't realize how transfixed he was upon this beautiful look into the past until night started falling. And he heard the sound of crickets. And he heard what in the distance he swore sounded like a werewolf. Which, if you don't know, is a wolf it's a man that turns into the wolf, but only upon the full moon. He didn't believe in werewolves, so this did not alarm him. But he went out to the castle. He stood at the entrance and got ready to walk down the road when he heard the first sounds of humanity, or at least he hoped it was, from the whole day. He heard the crunching of feet on a gravel road. But the steps were coming fast, almost as if somebody was running. And when they came around the bend, the same bend he had walked up, he did see a young woman running. She must have been 25 years old, and she had long brown hair, and she was wearing the strangest clothes. She was wearing a dress that looked like it had been homemade, and in her hair she had a circlet, which is kind of like a small, thin crown. And she said, they're coming, get inside the castle, run, pointing at Oslo. And Oslo said, who is coming? And she said, the people of the wolf, run! So they ran into the castle, and she started pulling on the giant wooden doors to close them. And she said, help, help! And so he started closing the giant wooden doors of the front gate too. And once they were closed, they both lifted up a giant piece of wood and put them into some metal hooks so that it would hold the door closed. I have trouble speaking. And as she held the door closed, or as they had just put the wood to hold the door closed, suddenly there was banging on the wood. And this was thick wood. It was maybe 6 inches thick, if not slightly thicker. And he imagined what it would be like, Oslo, for his fist to hit that wood. He thought it might make a little thunk, but it would hurt his hand. These thunks were massive. They sounded like something hitting the wood with a hammer or a club or a giant stone. And they were just raining down upon the door over and over, faster than he could have expected or even imagined possible. But what happened next scared him more than anything. He heard howling just outside the door, and then another howl joined it, and then another and another. There must have been 4 or 5, maybe even 6 of them out there. This absolutely freaked him out. And so she said, run, we must get into the deeper part of the castle. Follow me. And as they were running, Oslo said, who are you? And she looked at him and she said, it's a very long story. I'd rather not get into it right now. Run. And so they ran down stone hallways, some of them lined with red carpets that the rats and beetles had been eating. There was also mouse poop everywhere and dust. It was, it was an old castle. And finally, they got into a room that had a throne in it. Again, the throne was old, but it was in better shape as it was made out of iron. And they closed another door behind them, and they took a smaller piece of wood and closed that door as well. And she sat on the throne, and something looked right about her on that throne. And Oslo said, "Who are you?" And she looked at him and said, "You won't believe me if I tell you." And he said, "Try me." And so she told him, "I am Queen Millennia, and this is my castle." And Oslo said, "Queen Millennia? Like time? Like 1,000 years?" And she said, "Well, yeah, that's my name. I'd never thought about how it meant 1,000 years." And Oslo said, "Well, why are you here?" And she said, "I have never been able to leave these woods. I am the queen, and I've been cursed by an evil one of the wolf people, the master of them all. He cursed me to live forever, which might sound wonderful, but when you can never leave an abandoned castle, and none of your family or friends are still alive, and still these wolves, they haunt and chase and try to get me, it's not that fun living forever." And so Oslo said, "This is a joke. They must play these jokes on tourists all the time." So he took out the stone and he said, "Is her story true?" And slowly the purple woman manifested herself and looked deeply at Millennia and said, "She speaks the truth. She is cloaked in a dark magic. If you can help her break it, the world will be a better place." And then she went back into the stone. Oslo just sat down and put his hand on his head and said, "What is going on here?" But they didn't have time to even discuss it more because the banging had started on the door just behind them. Somehow they had gotten through the front gate. Oslo didn't know if they had bashed their way through with sheer strength or if there was a hole in the wall or perhaps a secret passage or some sort of ancient sewer that they could have crawled through. But that didn't matter, for the creatures were coming through. Now Millennia said, "Oslo, do you have any weapons?" And he reached into his backpack and said, "I've got this." And he had the Chinese star and the mask. And she looked at them and she said, "I see an aura of magic upon those both. Use them wisely." And Oslo thought about it and he said, "Okay, well, whoever's out there, they're stronger than I am. If this mask is all I have, I'll wear it." And so he put the mask on and he could see out of the wooden eye holes and breathe out of the wooden nose and mouth holes. But surprisingly, it went and sucked to his head, like tighter than he would have expected. And he thought, "I should have stayed home. I should have worked my boring job and become an old man and been happy." But he didn't have time for that line of thought anymore because the door exploded as if somebody had hit it with a giant axe. And what scared him the most was he saw 4-legged wolves that were standing on 2 legs. They had a face resembling human and hands that were half claw, half paw, and they were looking at him with red glowing eyes. And then they spoke. "Oh, Millennia, we've come for you." "Oh, who are you?" They looked at Oslo, and the one in the back started smacking his lips. "I sense a dinner for us to eat." And Oslo, without thinking, he did not know if it was fear or bravery that propelled him, took the Chinese star and chucked it at the middle werewolf. And it stuck into his shoulder and it went, "Oh!" and started howling. But mere seconds later, something unbelievable happened. The Chinese star exploded. And you could see the wound in the shoulder and you could see all of the werewolves fly in different directions. And Millennia said, "Run, Oslo, while they're distracted." And she led him behind the throne where she lifted up a trap door and they ran down a set of stairs. She grabbed a torch from the wall and lit it by means which he didn't understand, for she had no lighter, but yet the torch burned. And they ran down this narrow stone passageway. Before long, they could hear the sound of paws clopping behind them in the distance, but they did not know how many, and they didn't have the luxury of stopping. Finally, they went up a set of stairs that took them out into the woods, and they ran, and they climbed the first tree they could see. And Millennia that's a hard thing to say, she shushed Oslo and told him, to pretend to try to, blend in as best he could. And luckily, his wood mask actually kind of camouflaged him with a tree. And before long, 2 of the wolves came, and one of them had wounds all over him, and the other one, the one that seemed to be the leader, looked unhurt. "Where have they gone?" said the leader. "I don't know," said the other one, "but we must avenge our brothers." And just then, something terrible happened. A grasshopper jumped off of Oslo's mask onto one of the wolves, and the wolf went, "Ugh, grasshopper," and shooed him away. And then came another, and another, and another. And it took Oslo a moment to realize the grasshoppers were hopping from his mask. He took the mask off his head and looked at it, and there was a bunch of grasshoppers hanging there, looking like they were hanging from apple stems. And they were just growing, one after another. And they were jumping at the werewolves. And before long, the grasshoppers were jumping on the werewolves, getting into their nose, and the werewolves were getting quite agitated. Well, it was a distraction that Millennia needed. She climbed down from the tree. She drew a sword from her that had been strapped to the back of her belt, and she crept around back behind the werewolves. And the grasshoppers kept jumping until the werewolves were covered in hundreds of them, and they were flailing around madly. And before long, one of them fell to the ground and said, "Oh, get out of my nose!" And he was pulling a grasshopper out of his nose. And Millennia crept behind the leader of the wolf and put the sword up to him and said, "You will surrender." And the wolf looked at her. It was covered in grasshoppers, and they were still hopping down from the mask. And he said, "Oh, I don't know what sort of witchery or wizardry you've used, but I surrender." And Millennia said, "I need your word. Your word as a werewolf man." Because she knew that one of the strange intricacies about the werewolves was that if they told a promise, they could not go back on it. They could want to go back on it, but they were incapable of actually doing it. And they both said, "We promise we shall leave you alone." And Millennia said, No, that's not enough. I want you to promise you will leave all men alone, that you will travel to the deserts of Egypt and find a place, perhaps an oasis far away from anywhere else, and live there. And they growled and said, "I promise, get these grasshoppers off." And so Oslo took the mask and said, "Please, stop. We don't need you anymore. We are protected. Thank you for your help." And like magic, all the grasshoppers turned into leaves and blew away. And the mask went back to normal. And he thought it was the strangest thing ever. And so the werewolves limped away, nursing their wounds that they had gotten from the Chinese star explosion, and the grasshoppers apparently were biting them everywhere. And Millennia knew that she was safe. And she said, "Oslo, one last thing. Can you help me break the magic?" And he said, I don't know how. But then again, he remembered his stone. So he took out the stone, and he asked the stone, he said, "Stone, how do I break the magic on Millennia?" And the woman appeared, but this time she had a smile. And she said, "Well, this is the magic where only one true of heart, one who has put the world before his own needs, one who follows his heart and not his mind and not his greed, must give her a kiss and then marry her under the full moon." And Oslo looked at Millennia, and he had never realized just how beautiful she was. And she smiled at him and she said, "Yeah, I'd be willing to do that." And he said, "Wait, you marry somebody I just met? I don't even know what." So he asked the stone, and he said, "Stone, is this the right thing to do?" And again, the woman from the stone smiled and said yes. So he gave her a kiss, and it was the happiest he had ever been in his entire life. And he said, "But how are we going to get married?" And the woman from the stone said, "I can marry you. I was once both a priestess and a queen." And so they stood, hands clasped, gazing into each other's eyes, and they both found each other to be quite beautiful people. And they got married, and the curse went away. And they both hugged and kissed once more, and they walked back to the town, and Millennia stood at the road and said, "I've never been able to walk this far before." She took a step and she was able to walk over it. And that's the end of our story for tonight. But you must know that Millennia and Oslo, they got married. And for several years, they went around the world finding artifacts, helping those in need, solving crimes, and even thwarting evil. And then eventually, they had a family of 3 children, and they taught their children all the secrets they knew. And the family of Oslo and Millennia have been known as the greatest allies for goodness in all of history. Perhaps, though I make no guarantees, unless you have a stone that will tell the truth, perhaps we shall revisit Oslo and Millennia on another of their adventures in the future. But for now, I wish you a most excellent good night, Alden, and anyone else who might happen to see this video. Remember, imagination is all around you, and you can think and dream of any of these characters you want and make your own stories. Goodbye and good night.